Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rance Harden, and as a member of the AOC P&R Student Council Conference Committee, I want to welcome you to the third and final part of our financial series, leading up to the annual mid-year meeting being held in Tampa, Florida, from April 29th to May 1st. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Daniel Wrenne, who will be presenting on general financial planning for residents and fellows. Mr. Wrenne has worked as a certified financial planner since 2005. In 2014, he founded Wrenne Financial Planning, which is located in Lexington, Kentucky. Wrenne Financial Planning is a fee-only firm providing comprehensive financial planning for physicians and dentists that include necessary accountability, encouragement, and education along the way. Think of them as your financial trainer, consultant, and coach. They have over 40 years of combined experience providing financial advice professionally to physicians and other professionals. In addition to transparent pricing, they never receive commissions or kickbacks, and they are their clients' fiduciary at all times. And with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Wrenne.
All right, I appreciate it. I was just saying at the very beginning, I'm working from home, so if I have a kiddo run in the background, I apologize for that in advance, but we should be taken care of here with the TV over there. Anyway, so by day, as we just talked about, I'm a financial planner for physicians, and so I get a lot of good one-to-one experience helping people and families in you guys' shoes, through a lot of these personal finance topics, which is really enjoyable. I love doing that. It's also fun for me to do more of like the one-to-many type education like this. I also have a podcast that's kind of a similar approach where we can kind of talk general education and kind of, use my experience in the one-to-one world to help, share some of that stuff you guys need to know as you kind of work through life. So that's just kind of a general, intro and outline. Some of the specific topics that I'll plan to cover today. I guess before I go through this, I think we have a small enough group to where we can do questions as we go. So if you guys have questions, and I know there was at least one specific question beforehand that I'll address. But if you guys have questions along the way, let me know. I'm not good about checking the chat, so somebody tell me if there's a chat. Anyway, so the topics we'll cover are listed here, but we'll start out with just kind of a general overview of like what is financial planning, and then we'll talk about some of the specific stuff like student loans and insurances and tax and investments. Each one of these topics is could be a hour-long presentation in itself at a minimum. I mean, there's books written about each of these topics, so I'm going to hit the really high points of each of these and really zero in on like early career, personal finance for physicians. So financial planning, so starting with financial planning, really what that's about is it's about helping you get from where you are today to your ideal future. And, the path, we like to draw a straight line in financial planning when we do these sort of, plans, but like in reality, life is more like this line. It's like all over the place. Like things don't go as planned and life changes and, something happens and whatnot. But ideally, you're kind of making adjustments along the way and you get to that point of your ideal future. And financial planning is that process of getting you there. So a couple of quick definitions. So a financial plan is, charting out that specific path. It's kind of like the map of getting you from point A to point B. Financial planning is more of the lifelong experience, like the journey of getting there, over time and making adjustments along the way and charting the course. Really, I think financial planning is by far the best approach to help you get, everybody wants to get to that, ideal life. And financial planning is by far the best approach to get you there. So it's a fantastic process. And some people think of it as like, oh, that's for rich people or whatever. Or I'm not ready for it. But you don't have to have any money. I mean, financial planning works for anyone. Like I teach financial planning principles to my kids, so it can work for anyone. And it's always something that the sooner you start doing these things, the better. So hopefully, everyone that's listening would benefit from, starting to utilize these processes. So just quick overview. This is just a quick overview. I'll give you a little bit more on each of these of what that process looks like. Before I go through these a little more specifically, I think it's good to, really hammer down on like why do planning, and ultimately it's about getting you to that ideal place. But along the way, like by having a good plan, you're going to feel confident in your decision making. I'm sure you've made decisions before where you're kind of like waffling. So ideally, you're in that confidence place and feeling on track, motivated, and ultimately having your actions in alignment with your values. That's what this is about. Now, the alternative is, so if you don't have a plan, you're going to tend to gravitate towards like this guy, like sticking your head in the sand, or feeling like money's just kind of flowing out in different places and you're not sure where it's going. So we want to stay away from that. So the financial planning process, it always starts with clarifying what's most important, or your values, priorities, and goals. So like, what do you value and why, and then how do you prioritize those, and then use all that to kind of start to iron out your goals. So, if, for example, well, like for me, it's like I value spending time with my family, and so that's a value, and so it's going to be a higher priority for me. And in fact, I mean, it's kind of a reason why my goals are what they are. So I want to, travel more and, be able to not work too hard, and be able to retire at some reasonable age. A lot of that is driven based on me wanting to spend time with my family. So once you have it's important to have all that ironed out first, because that's like what makes life good. So once you have that ironed out, then, the rest of this is going to flow easier. So the second phase is like organizing, your numbers. This is much more straightforward. It can get overwhelming, but it's definitely, more logical and straightforward. So I'm just throwing out some tools that I like to use to help people get organized with their numbers. And I think I sent some links to some of these tools. This will link to like a guide that has all sorts of like spreadsheets to help you get organized. But if I was to say one thing to do to like start to get your finances organized, it would be like to start tracking your net worth. So a net worth tracker, I call it a net worth tracker, but all it is a listing of all your assets, like everything you own, and then a listing of all your debts, and then assets minus, so stuff that you own minus stuff that you owe or debt, that's what your net worth is. And so tracking it over time is really valuable because you start to see kind of like how things are changing. So, I do it personally every month. Like as of the first of the month, I write down all the values, assets, and then liabilities, and then just track it each month. So I think that exercise alone puts you in a position to where you're feeling like you know what's going on. Also, if you guys are earlier in the game, you might say, oh, I only have like one or two accounts. It's like, well, I'll just wait till things are complicated. But like, no. Start when you have like one account. It's a heck of a lot easier to start tracking your net worth when you have one account. It's much simpler to write down one thing. So over time, like you end up with like 15 accounts. So that's ideally you start to get in that habit early on. And then the third kind of phase of planning is where you get into like analyzing, deciding, and executing. And so ideally, you have these values and goals and priorities ironed out and you're organized before you start getting into like decision making and analyzing and executing. That's ideally how it works. But there's a lot of temptation, I think, to get these out of order. My favorite, I guess, probably a common example we see with clients in your all's phase of life is in transition phases, because there's a lot of transitions and big changes. So going into practice, especially. So the classic example I use is like transitioning into practice. The temptation, well, there's a lot of change. I mean, there's not a lot of time, which is kind of a hard situation in itself. And then, maybe you're moving to a different area, and so there's a temptation to just kind of jump into like execution mode without really doing the first two steps. So I've talked to many people that are like, yeah, I'm going to get this, house that's whatever price it is. And, it's just because somebody told me I needed to. So ideally you're saying, okay, well, my values are, X, Y, Z, and, I've prioritized stuff, and this is how it fits into the puzzle. And it allows you to make a more logical decision. It's okay to seek out help. I mean, it's great to seek help out in certain cases when you need it or want it, but I would just be cautious with it, especially and finances and money can get a little taboo anyway. So when you're seeking out help, even whether it's through like a financial planner like me or like a friend or a family or whoever it is, I would encourage you to think about expertise, like how whatever question you're asking them, what is their expertise on it, how much experience do they have, what conflicts of interest, especially when you start getting into my industry, and our industry has lots of conflicts of interest, and just or bias, like your parents, my mom, I ask her a question about something like that, she's always going to say whatever I want her to say, so she's just skewed towards that. So understanding all that is important before you ask for help. But there's plenty of good help out there. Understanding all that will allow you to, capitalize on that. And then I think the biggest thing is just educating yourself. I don't think you can get around that. A lot of people think they can kind of just hire somebody to do this stuff for them. That doesn't really work. So you got to educate yourself as well, even if you are paying someone to help you. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the pieces of the puzzle that often come up in financial planning. So student loans, back in the day, I don't know how old everybody is in this group, but back in the early days, back when I got student loans, they were very simple. It was like two choices. I mean, it was just like getting a normal debt, like an auto loan or something. It was just super straightforward. You pay off the debt and it has an interest rate. But nowadays it's a completely different game. It's like a very, very complicated puzzle. So what changed was when they introduced these forgiveness programs and income-based repayments. That's what changed the game on student loans. So nowadays, I'm sure some of you have student loans, probably the majority. And so with student loans, everybody's using income-based repayment. Right now, I guess nobody's paying anything because of COVID forbearance, which just got extended again. I don't know if y'all have seen that news. It keeps getting extended. So right now, you're not responsible for making any payment. But when that eventually, or if, I guess, that eventually turns back on, it's going to be based on income. And so that's a very unique thing. And the reason that becomes complicated is your income's like it changes. There's a lot of factors that affect your income, like if you get married or if you contribute even to like a retirement plan. There's all these factors that affect income. How do you measure income? Do you use a pay stub? Do you use a tax return? Which year do you use? When do you report it? So that in itself, like the fact that it was tied to income, made it complicated. And then you have the PSLF forgiveness stuff, which is, pretty confusing. And it was early on, especially in itself. Basically, you have to work for a qualified employer with the right type of loans and make the right type of repayment plan 120 times, and then you get forgiveness. So that's PSLF in a nutshell. along the way, people started to realize it wasn't quite as simple as it sounded on the surface, and the servicers were having a lot of trouble uh, servicing it. So there was a lot of it's gotten cleaned up quite a bit of late. So, but PSLF in itself, there's lots of gray and a lot of check boxes to check, basically. But it is a fantastic program if you check all the check boxes right. It's all tax free. So if at forgiveness, it's like non-taxable event. So a lot of physicians, it's a home run. A lot of our clients that we work with one-on-one, like it's a fantastic deal for them. In like academic medicine or hospitals, if they're going to put in the 10 years, it's a great deal. So you gotta watch where you're getting advice from on this, because it's become so complicated. The gist of it is to pay as little as possible. That's why COVID forbearance is such a home run for people, especially going for PSLF. Those payments still count towards PSLF, which is excellent. So if you were otherwise going to pay, several $1,000s, that's just, obviously that's like free money for PSLF. So the goal of PSLF is to pay as little as possible over that 120 payment time. One thing I would encourage everybody that maybe, even if you're potentially going for PSLF, if you're not already in this habit, I would get in a habit of verifying employment every 12 months. So this is a link to the form. Hopefully y'all have seen this, but it's actually a really easy form with your basic info, and then you put in your employment start and end date, and then your employer signs it. And so I think that's a very good habit to get in if you have federal loans and there's a chance you go for PSLF. The reason is because that's kind of like your check on, it's like a progress report, really. And so if you do 12 payments at a time, it's not a big deal. Where people get into trouble is when they're trying to verify like 50 payments at a time or like 100 payments at a time. And that's a heck of a lot harder to do. So PSLF it gets complicated, especially if you're married, especially in situations in certain states, community property states. If you're married and both spouses are going through PSLF, that's about as complicated as it gets. So I would consider seeking out advice for this, especially if you're in the category of, married, dual spouse, both going for PSLF. There's another program, the 20 or 25-year forgiveness program, which is less common, but is potentially of benefit for this crew. It's a little more complicated because it's 20 years. It's 20 or 25 years. That's a really long time to do an analysis for. So this program generally works when the balance of the loans is really, really high relative to the income you expect to make. The big, I guess, downside of it at this point is it's a taxable forgiveness. So, that's painful on the back end. Basically, it's just like triggering a bunch of income when they forget it. So there's lots of these are all, good programs for people with student loans, but they are definitely, they can get complicated. I already mentioned the COVID forbearance a little bit. It's a big deal. I don't know how long. They keep saying that this is the last time that they're going to extend it, and then they extend it again. So I have no idea how long they'll keep extending it. PSL forgiveness, we've had clients getting forgiveness, so it is happening. If you have your ducks in a row, it's actually pretty straightforward. So that's excellent. There is another new program. It's called the PSLF waiver. I think that's available until Halloween of this year. That's beneficial if you had loans early in on the game. If you guys had loans like before 2000 and maybe 11 or something like that, or if you're maybe if you had loans declined for qualification, or there was just some questionable stuff, I would look into this PSLF waiver, because it's kind of like an exception to some of these nuanced rules. And then the last point I'll make on student loans, it might make sense to refinance at some point. I would not consider that unless you're 100% sure you're not going for PSLF. I've seen too many people like prematurely refinance and regret it. So I would be like 100% sure before you do that, and including even your spouse. That's the thing. You want to make sure both you and your spouse are not going for PSLF before you refinance. But the gist of it is like when the federal loans start charging interest again, their interest payments are pretty high, or their interest rates are pretty high. So private companies have offered much lower rates. So, if things go back to normal, there is a good incentive to refinance because, typically you can get a lower rate. But I would be extra cautious with that. So that's student loans. The next thing I was going to talk about, risks and some of the stuff. I mean, you never know. Sometimes there's something lurking behind you. You don't even realize it. And so there's a lot of risks to think about. I'll throw out a few that we typically see as the biggies. I think cash is important at any phase in life, but in training, it might not be quite as, on average, complicated. Maybe you're just having like a buffer of like 1 month of spending to kind of, in case something doesn't go as planned, and just also to kind of limit the stress. It's kind of stressful to have like zero cash, and so having a little buffer of cash is helpful. And then on top of that, it's ideally you have kind of like some of these other risks, like job loss, or crazy stuff happens. You just don't. Especially if you own a house, maybe you have a roof blows off, insurance doesn't cover it, that kind of thing. So cash is helpful for covering risks. Insurance. The nice thing about these vehicles, we have access to these insurances that'll cover a lot of the big risks. So the big risks, these are the things that like you're going to not be able to cover, or it's going to be very difficult to have the money to cover it. So long-term disability is a big one, especially when this one is most important when you're at the early stage of your career because you haven't yet earned the income. Term life insurance is a big one. Same thing. I kind of look at these top two as like income insurances more than anything. And then, of course, these others are important. Malpractice, typically the hospitals will provide pretty good benefits there. So insurances that I see sometimes people are getting but probably don't need, whole life insurance. Long-term care is a tricky one, but ideally you don't need that. Short-term disability, and then there's a bunch of like little insurances. So tax. So tax is another big one. I don't know if I've ever talked to anybody that's like doesn't want to minimize taxes. So it's the strategy is pretty straightforward. It's like let's try to minimize taxation. So there's a lot of vehicles out there that are offered to help you minimize tax. So that's one of the questions actually that was thrown out before this was kind of related to this last slide I had, and also tax shelters, I believe. But the question was about like Roth IRAs, which is one of the tax shelters available, and if that's not available due to income, is it make any sense ever to use like a permanent life insurance vehicle as an alternative retirement plan? I think that was the gist of the question. So first of all, Roth IRAs actually they do phase out at a certain income level where you over certain income, you can't use them. But there is like a backdoor kind of route into them. They call it a backdoor Roth IRA. But technically, it's just taking a couple of steps to get into a Roth IRA. So if you use this backdoor route, it doesn't matter what your income is, you can still fund it. So if you're not maximizing a Roth IRA, first thing is I would do a backdoor Roth IRA. And that's certainly going to be better than using whole life insurance. No question. You just have to take an extra step to get into it and make sure you're checking the check boxes. There's all kinds of stuff. If you're in that situation where you are over that limit, there's all kinds of stuff online, like good stuff you can read about backdoor Roth IRAs to kind of just make sure you understand the gist of it. But it's a great tax shelter. It's a good way to sock away money that is avoiding tax. So this example, that's an example of tax me now. So I like to look at these tax shelters as like tax me now or tax me later. So Roth IRA is an example of like tax me now, because when you put money into it, that money will have already been taxed. Usually it gets taxed on your check, like your paycheck. So you pay tax as it comes in on your paycheck. In exchange, and then you put it in the Roth IRA, and it grows. You get older. When you're retired, you take it out. The big benefit is, since you've already paid tax now, when you're older, there is no tax in the Roth IRA. So it's like tax me now, but tax free later. On the other hand, there's another kind of group of retirement plans that is more like avoid tax now, but tax me later. So the most common example is like your 401k or 403b through work. If you fund those plans like a traditional 403b or 401k, which most of you, some of you may have access to these, but that type of plan goes in before taxes get charged. So it's like pre-tax or, no tax going in. And then it grows, and then when you're older, that's when they tax you. So it's all about like which one, tax me now versus tax me later. The question I would always ask is like, well, which one's better? That's what everybody asks. So it depends on, I'll show you an example of this, or talk through an example of this briefly in a minute. It's not as complicated as it might seem, but these are two of the biggest categories of tax shelters. I think for the average physician, the bigger thing is that you are maximizing tax shelters. Like the average physician we work with is able to maximize all of these. Like maybe you have a 403b and you max that out, and then you're doing the backdoor Roth IRA. So then you're maxed out on all this stuff. Now, sometimes you have access to a 457 too, and that gives you like a separate. So these two have separate max. So it's like 20,500 here, 20,500 here, and then the backdoor Roth IRA. So the bigger thing is that you're, working to maximize all these things before you ever do other types of investments that are not tax sheltered. And then the second thing is like, picking between which one is better. The other type of tax shelter, which is less common, is like the truly tax-free tax shelter. Like this is the best you can get. Like it's much better than these others we just talked about. And there's only one that, there's some like kind of questionable loopholes, but there's only one like what I would consider like legit, truly tax-free tax shelters, and that's the health savings account. So the health savings account, remember I was talking about like tax me now or tax me later. So the health savings account is like tax me never, So it goes in before taxes get charged, and then it grows without taxation. And then as long as you use it for the right things, which would be healthcare, then it's tax-free coming out. So no tax going in, no tax as it grows, no tax coming out. So some people will be like, well, how do I know how much healthcare I'm going to have? Well, if you're young, odds are like a lot, because you're eventually going to be old. Hopefully it's a long way from now, but, so there's typically plenty of healthcare in the future, especially on the later stages of life. So it's a great way to like proactively stockpile that money in a tax sheltered way for like later stage life. And then in the worst case, the health savings account backup is like a 401k. So if you get in a position where the health savings account is like you can't find a good healthcare, like you've run out of healthcare stuff to spend it on, it functions just like a 401k after age 65. So like the backup it's like a 401k after 65. So some people are probably like, what in the world is he talking about? Like, he just said health savings account and age 65 in retirement. So just to clarify, like, this is completely different than like flex spending account. There's other healthcare savings accounts. You have to use it or lose it. So this health savings account, the special part about it is it does not require you to take the money out each year, which, in other words, it allows you to build wealth in it. It's like a wealth building vehicle. And so you can invest in it as well in most good HSAs. So an HSA is basically should be functioning just like a backdoor Roth IRA or any of these other vehicles. So that's by far the best tax shelter that's out there. But the catch with it is you do have to have like a qualified health care plan to have access to them. But if you do have that, then it can be a fantastic tool. There's a ton of stuff I've written about this. Lots of resources on this we can share if you want to dig into the details. And then taxable investments, that's kind of like once you've covered all these things, maybe start to consider that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But going back to the scenario of like, which one do I choose? So if you are able to use the HSA, that's always number one. Like that's a fantastic tax shelter. Well, let me back up. If you have a match on your retirement plan, that's always number one because that's like free money. So you want to do that first. And then the second priority would be the HSA because it's got such a good tax shelter. Once you get to that third, it gets a little more complicated. So that's when you get to like, well, do you do the tax me now versus tax me later? Should you do like a Roth IRA or a traditional 401k? So I mentioned earlier it's not as complicated as you might think. So it's really the 90% of the decision or 90% of the analysis is dependent on like what your marginal tax rate is or what your tax bracket is now versus what your tax bracket is going to be when you're taking money out. So if you're in training and you're like down here, like say you're single and in training, maybe you're in this range. This is like tax bracket example. This is 2019, by the way, so it's not going to be much different, but you'll get the gist of it either way. So let's say you're single in training, you're going to be in one of these three. And then you know you're soon to get married, and when you look at your future spouse and your income, and you're probably going to be in one of these brackets eventually, like later in life. So when you have that kind of scenario, it's like, okay, I'm here and I'm going to be there. It's like, well, shoot, I'll pay the taxes now. Tax me now, sure, yeah, great. Let's do tax now, and then I'd rather avoid this one. So that's where the Roth IRAs are tax me now. So Roth IRAs work great in that situation because you pay 10 or 12 or max 22% on the money coming in, And then you don't pay tax when you're in this like high rate. And then you can the flip side can happen. It's like, if you're in the high now and then you're probably going to be a little lower later, that's when the traditional 401ks work well. So when you're in the middle, when you're like, I have no idea, a lot of people are like, well, I'm somewhere in here and I'm probably going to stay somewhere in here. Then I kind of tend to lean towards like, let's just split the difference, have both, so you can kind of have some flexibility. So that's tax in 10 minutes or less. Okay, so in investments, I don't know how much you guys have looked at investment stuff, but like the temptation for everyone is to look at performance. Like I've done it, I've always done it before. You look at, and they even give you, a lot of times when you get paperwork for it, it shows performance. So when performance is actually a terrible indicator of the future. In fact, I wouldn't really even, dig into it too much because it's such a bad indicator. It's so bad that they even have a disclaimer at the bottom. If you ever read into it, like if any of that paperwork they have on the internet or give you, it has a disclaimer at the bottom that says basically like past performance is a terrible indicator of future performance, so don't look too hard at this. So anyway, expenses are actually a far better indicator of future performance. So if you had any filter to use to kind of screen stuff, I would look at expenses, and lower is generally better. And when I say expenses, I mean like the fund expenses. Sometimes advisors charge hidden expenses on investments, and then taxes are really an expense too. So that's where we were just talking about the tax sheltering. Like ideally, you kind of avoid those taxes, and that's going to lower your overall expenses. In a nutshell, like I think if I'm starting in investing, another temptation is to kind of say, okay, how do I pick the winners and losers? Like how do I find the opportunities to make money and avoid the things that are bad? So like I'm going to look into how to beat the market or that kind of thing. So that's a temptation. And that would be, I would consider that active investing. What I would encourage everyone to do is, especially early on, is I think a better approach is to go more of a passive route. So a passive route is just to like own the entire market. So like you can own every single stock that exists, and it's actually really easy to do nowadays. Most retirement plans through work have like plenty of good passive options. So Vanguard is a good example of a company that's like 80% of their funds are passive funds. So I think my advice would be, until you have really good financial literacy and can explain exactly what you're doing and why, always go passive. The research shows that tends to translate to better results, even for the people that know what they're doing. Real estate, I don't think we have too much time for that, but there's a lot of hype around investing in real estate, so I would baby step into that. Get the basics first, and then that could be kind of like a second tier of investing. Estate planning is a big one. That's probably one of the most overlooked areas. I would say it's the most difficult thing for our clients to get done. Like they just struggle with this stuff. Sorry, I'm seeing that there's a few chats. See, I'm bad at looking at the chat. Okay, I'm going to cover some of these questions because I don't really want to talk about estate planning now. What you need to know about estate planning is, when you get married, and especially when you have children, at a minimum, you really need to have a will, and preferably all this stuff. Okay, so when people talk about emergency funds, is this money in a specific account, or is this just money in their savings account that they see as emergencies? Is there an account bucket system we can set up somewhere and put money into that is purely for emergencies? Okay, so that's a good question. It's just a savings account. Really, it should be. Some people have these schemes that they've created, but really, it should just be a simple savings account, emergency savings. As far as the system to use for just the savings account itself, like I would just go simple is better and use a separate account at your bank. As far as like the budgeting to kind of keep up with where your money's going, like YNAB is YNAB is a good tool to use to make a plan for where your money's going, and to help, that kind of helps you to build your emergency savings if that's a goal. If I'm going to one hospital for intern year that offers a Roth 401k and then another hospital for advanced residency, is there an issue with opening up the Roth 401k at the one hospital for 1 year, then going to another? What if the second hospital doesn't offer a Roth 401k? What happens to the one I opened up? Okay, so if it's a Roth 401k, and really a 401k in general, you can move it wherever, especially a Roth 401k. That's actually even more flexible. Like you can move a Roth 401k into a Roth IRA. So no issue with that, with going one place with a Roth and then going to another place without one. In the event you go to the second place that doesn't have a Roth 401k, you can just roll it over to a Roth IRA. Or just leave it there, actually. I mean, you can leave it at the old place. You just have to keep up with it. I mean, you have to stay organized and keep track of it. Let's say I have a 401a with one employer, then the next year I go to a new employer with a 403b. Can I still contribute to the 401a? And 403b, or should I consolidate them in some way? So you cannot contribute to old employer plans. I think that's what this question is asking. Yes, okay. Yeah, so you can't contribute to old plans. So you just have to leave it. Most plans let you leave it there, and you can just let it hang out, which is a common question is like, does that hurt my return to like leave an old plan and not, like, or in other words, is it better to consolidate for return purposes? That's a common question, but it has no effect on return. Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect your return, so it's not that big of a deal to leave it there. Just let it hang out. But I like consolidating for simplicity purposes if you can. And then sometimes these plans have different expenses, so there's some incentive to do it there. Okay, this is just... Okay, any other questions that I didn't cover? I just wanted to take a break. I saw there was a few built up in here. Yeah, no problem. Okay, and I think we're getting closer to the end, and we can circle back if other questions pop up. So, yeah, as I was saying with estate planning, it's good to get. It's really good to get. It depends on your state. If you don't have these documents, it's going to default to like your state laws. So, for example, I live in Kentucky, and if you are married and pass away without a will, half your stuff goes to your spouse and half your stuff goes to your next of kin, which is typically not how people want it to work. So most people want their spouse to get 100% of their stuff, but the only way to do that is to have a will. So pretty much everybody that's married should probably have a will. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. Like, you can get a little simple template online when you're starting out. You don't have to get like the Mac Daddy will right off the bat. In fact, like in some states, you can literally write it on handwritten and sign it. They call it a holographic will. So that's definitely better than not having one at all. These other documents are all, I'm sure y'all are familiar with some of these, but they're good to have. And just in general, having stuff organized is good for estate planning purposes. Like if something were to happen as you get married, especially as life gets complicated, that goes back to staying organized with your finances. This all kind of works together, but if you can have like your financial affairs kind of like boiled down to like a few pages and have some like, a summary of key contacts and, that kind of thing, that's huge if something happens. Because normally what happens is, maybe you're married and your one spouse tends to do a lot of this stuff and the other spouse tends to not know as much about what's going on. So if it happens to be that the one spouse that does all this stuff passes away unexpectedly or gets disabled, the other spouse can be like, I have no idea where to even start. And, that is kind of like fantastic way to not only stay organized while you're around, but like if something were to happen, it's huge benefit to help your spouse. So financial advisors, I'll first of all, everybody listening y'all have the, I would say, knowledge and skill if you want to do all this stuff yourself. It's not rocket science. It's not, everybody's different. It can be more challenging. Some people don't like doing this stuff. Some people have trouble with the accountability. Like, I just hired somebody to help me work out, and it was not, for this example, it was completely not a lack of knowledge. I wanted to do it. Like I had the desire. For in that situation, I really just needed the accountability. So, on the other hand, some people lack the knowledge and the time, and so there's whatever the reason, you guys can completely do all the stuff yourself, or maybe you are like me in certain phases of life, and you're like, oh, I need to hire help, or we need to get somebody in here to kind of shortcut this. So if you do go down that route, I think it's good to know like the gist of how our industry works, because we're not great about being transparent with all this stuff. I'm talking about the industry in general. So like a financial advisor really should be helping you, that first process I was talking about, they should be helping you through that process and using that to help you get from, point A to point B, and give you specific advice on steps to take along the way and how to get there, and help you manage all this stuff along the way. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, you still got to educate yourself. If at a minimum, just to know, like, if they're competent. Like, you can't, you need to be able to ask the questions to kind of at least measure that they're going to do a good job for you. So it's a lot of our best clients are really smart on personal finance. So that's not necessarily a reason not to work with somebody or to work with somebody. I think that's just a prerequisite for everyone in general. And then with our industry and how we make money, that gets a little confusing too. So there's two primary ways financial advisors make money. There's commissions and fees. So commissions are, well, if y'all are early in training, y'all probably get hammered by like insurance financial advisors over email like all day long, where they're just trying to sell you disability insurance or that kind of thing. If you haven't started getting that, I'm sure you will at some point. A lot of them are financial advisors if you look at their title. And so what's happening there, and so if you sit down with somebody like that, I'm sure they'll probably, or a lot of them will say, they're like offering financial advice for free. So that's like the free advisor. But they're not, they're still making money, but they're really just, the part that's important to clarify there is they're really a salesperson. So I think it's important to kind of remember that and be careful with taking, there's conflicts there, so the advice is going to be skewed towards the product that they sell. It'd be like going to a car salesman and saying, "Hey, how much should I spend on the car?" You know, they're going to be like, "Well, I got this fancy one here in the garage." So, so that's the commission approach. I think these kind of advisors typically approach you, just kind of the nature of a salesperson in general, but like they're going to approach you, they're going to track you down, that kind of thing. The other setup is like more fee-based setup. So in other words, you just pay for advice, and there's a lot of different ways you might pay, but that's a little bit, that's more of a pure fee-for-service setup, so less conflict of interest. I mean, that's my preferred route, because there's less conflicts. It's easier to, especially if you're, I mean, I feel like conflicts of interest are something I'd like to avoid. So if you want to avoid conflicts as much as possible, you got to avoid commissions and go for like fee for service. Those are the two main ways. Actually, there's a third way I'll throw out there. Like most advisors, or a lot of advisors, actually do both of these, which is even more confusing. So it's like, so they might charge a fee, plus they might also make commissions. So a quick way to figure out if they're a commission-based person is to look at their website and look at the small print. If you can stand to read the small print, like read the small print at the bottom of the website, and you'll see like words like broker, dealer, broker is a key word, or insurance. Those are two important words. Usually if you see those two words, that's a hint that they're probably in this category. But there's lots of different ways to look. If you all have questions on this any of this type of stuff, I'm happy to answer more specific questions. And then, beyond that, experience and designations and all that kind of stuff, that's important. Last thing I'll talk about is employment contracts. So going back to the financial planning process, I try to encourage that in all these different areas. So I think it's important to, even with considering jobs, like think about like what's most important to you. So most people value like working with good people and a good culture and that kind of stuff, and they value living in a good area where their family's close by. Like those are typically values we hear people throw out. So when you're looking for jobs, it's sometimes easy to zero in on like money and what they're going to pay. So and sometimes that leads you away from those big values. So I think it's good to, first of all, like remind yourself, hey, let's focus on the values that I have as I go to screen jobs, because then you can kind of screen it through your values. And you go interview at a place, you're like, yeah, they're going to pay a lot, but like this is not in alignment with what I think is most important. So I would put that above the money, all the other money stuff. But eventually you do get into the money, and that's important too, but like it's secondary. So, but when you get into the money, I would think in terms of like dollar per hour. You also want to look at total compensation, but sometimes if you're looking at one or two jobs, or two or three jobs, sometimes like job A pays say like $200,000 a year, and job B pays like $210,000 a year, but like job A is like 40 hours a week, and job B is like 70 hours a week. So it's like if you can kind of like peel back the layers of like how much the actual work commitment is, I think that's helpful to make that decision, because it's a dollar. Ultimately it's time. You're trading time for dollars. So and then student loan stipends, like a lot of these hospitals are offering student loan forgiveness or stipends, they call it usually. So they're gonna sometimes they'll offer to like pay some of your student loans off, but you want to be careful with that and how it integrates with PSLF. Like I've seen that totally conflict with PSLF, even for a hospital that's PSLF qualified. So, but you can negotiate this kind of stuff. Like you can be like, no, don't pay it straight to the student loan servicer because it's going to mess up my PSLF. So also, the other part that's important, tail coverage and non-competes. Tail coverage is probably the most, I would say both of these are important, but tail coverage, so that's like malpractice insurance, depending on like what specialty you're in. If you leave an employer, sometimes they make you cover malpractice risk after you leave. So what can happen there is like if the job doesn't work out and you have to leave, you end up having to write a big check to buy a big insurance policy to cover all the malpractice risk that happened while you were there. So, but you can avoid that on the front end by just looking at the contract and making sure they're covering that. And they call it, tail coverage is the terminology a lot of people use, but that's when so if the hospital covers your tail coverage, that means they're going to cover all malpractice claims while you're there and after you leave from work you did while you were there. So all that being said, I think it's important to hire someone to help with this, especially if it's like your first job. And there's all kinds of good contract consultants and attorneys that can help. But I would look for someone that has done this a lot. That's, I think, the key screen there. So that is kind of very quick, high-level overview of some of the big stuff. As I mentioned, I'm happy to answer questions. I think I mentioned we do a podcast as well. So we a lot of times people have questions and they throw it out to us, and especially like stuff we want to dig into. So we can, if you all throw out questions, we can dig into it in a podcast as well, especially if it's like a little bit more in-depth questions. So feel free to throw those out. Any questions for now? I think we have zero time, but I can answer one final question. There's none in the chat, so we're good. Yeah.
Mr. Wrenne, I think you've done an excellent job of kind of laying out an outline that really gives people the tools to start thinking about these things, and a lot of pressure being the final question. But I think as we're moving into residency, I think, something that I think about, and I'm sure others do as well, is given our, financial constraints, within the earning potential we have, what are the best ways that we can really start building, that wealth and that financial future, kind of working within that constrainment versus, opportunities down the road. Because sometimes it feels like, well, I don't have enough money to invest in the way that I want to and to build those resources. What do you have to say to something like that?
I think training is the opportune time to focus in on the education aspect and the habits aspect. So good financial habits, like all this stuff I talked about is a little bit more geared towards habit formation than it is like technical knowledge. But there is that technical knowledge too, so that's where the education comes in. So I think in training, it's like the best time to focus in on like building the habits and getting the education, because there's less. It's the good news about that description you just gave is there's less at stake. Like you don't have, there are financial constraints, but there's also like less resources to potentially make decisions on. There's less decisions to make. It's like more money, more problems. Like the more money you have, the more things you got to decide what to do with it. So it's actually one of the best times to like decide, you know, how am I going to handle this? So habit formation would be like, number one, where does the money go, you know, on a month-to-month basis? Like that habit in itself, if you have control of that, like you'll be able to, you know, take this thing wherever you want to go. And then all the technical stuff is just supplemental. So
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. And y'all are doing a good job of sitting in this. That's a fantastic first step, sitting at this on your evening, proactively seeking out education. Like that is a huge first step.
Well, we certainly respect and value your time that you gave to us this evening as well, and we appreciate that. Um, if there are no other questions, we'd like to continue to respect your time, and we'll draw this meeting to a close. And we look forward to seeing everyone at mid-year meeting at the end of the month.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.